History rarely announces itself with a speech. Sometimes it arrives as a stopwatch, 6 minutes long, and then the world is different. At roughly 10:24 in the late morning sky, the dive begins. Wind screams along the fuselage. Airframes shudder under the strain. The ocean rises like a wall, and the target, once a distant shape, fills the gunsight with a clarity that makes escape feel impossible. In that vertical plunge, time compresses. There is only angle, speed, and the steady hand that holds the aircraft in place as gravity tries to tear it apart. Bombs fall through smoke and flak, and the first carrier blooms into fire with a violence that looks instantaneous. What follows is not a gradual sinking or a slow duel of attrition. It is sudden systemic collapse. On decks crowded with armed aircraft, surrounded by fuel lines and stacked ordnance, a single successful hit becomes more than an explosion. It becomes ignition. Within minutes, Kaga and Soryu are burning with an intensity that overwhelms the routines meant to contain it. Akagi, flagship and symbol, is struck and soon becomes a furnace of expanding fires, heat spreading through hangars and passageways where aircraft and munitions had been prepared for the next strike. The carriers are still floating, still physically present on the sea, but their purpose is evaporating into smoke. An American pilot pulls out low, the aircraft clawing back from the dive as the horizon snaps into place. He looks back over his shoulder, needing confirmation for what his mind refuses to accept. These were supposed to be the most protected ships afloat. They are now burning islands, their flight decks warped, their aircraft trapped and exploding in place. On Japanese decks, training fights chaos. Damage control parties run hoses into smoke they can barely breathe. Orders are shouted. Men sprint with extinguishers and stretchers, trying to restore procedure as heat overtakes intent. Yet carrier warfare is fragile. It depends on continuous flight operations, and fire is the one enemy that interrupts everything. Now the turning point is unmistakable. The carriers are not merely damaged. Their ability to project air power is collapsing. And in real time, over open water, the Dauntless is redefined, from fat and slow to the instrument that punctures empires. The first sign of danger that morning was not enemy aircraft or flak, but a fuel needle, inching quietly toward empty. Dawn breaks over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, with no sense of ceremony. The ocean below is cold and metallic, stretching without landmarks or mercy. Above it, American aircraft move in long formation, engines droning with a monotonous persistence. There is no coastline to explain their presence, no visual cue to suggest where the war might begin. Only distance, vast, unhelpful distance. In the cockpit, pilots glance less at the sky than at their instruments. Fuel gauges matter more than altitude, because out here, a small miscalculation does not mean damage, it means disappearance. The Pacific itself becomes the first opponent, demanding precision before combat even begins. The Douglas SBD Dauntless carries an uncomfortable reputation into the air. It is sturdy, almost blunt in its design, lacking the sleek confidence of modern fighters. Many call it fat and slow, an aircraft caught between roles, too heavy to evade, too sluggish to escape. In an age increasingly obsessed with speed, the Dauntless feels like a compromise that history has already begun to leave behind. Inside the cockpit, the world narrows to vibrating metal, salt haze, and the steady pull of the engine. Hands rest on familiar controls, yet the silence carries a question no one voices. Will we even find them? Over open water, search is faith measured in miles. Far ahead, beyond sight, beyond certainty, the Japanese carrier force operates with calm precision. Aircraft are cycled, fuel lines connected, ordnance prepared. Doctrine hums smoothly. The assumption is quiet but firm. The sea is secured, and the battle will unfold on familiar terms. For now, there is no violence, no tracers, no sudden fear, only the unsettling sense that history is approaching at cruising speed. Modern war has a habit of mocking its future victors first, and somewhere beyond the empty horizon, the aircraft dismissed as inadequate is flying toward the one moment where reputation will no longer matter, only arrival will. It did not begin with a grand maneuver or a carefully staged duel, only a sudden shape in the high blue, appearing where no one expected anything to be. Late morning on June 4, 1942, the sky seems to open, and American dive bombers arrive from altitude, hard, vertical, and unforgiving. For the men on the Japanese carriers below, there is barely time to interpret what they are seeing. A moment earlier, the war still feels controlled by procedure. Flight decks busy, aircraft being armed, fuel lines connected, crews moving with the confidence of repetition. Then the first bombs strike, and the Pacific War changes in the space of minutes. Kaga, Soryu, and Akagi are hit and set ablaze in rapid succession, fires blooming so quickly that witnesses later struggle to describe them as anything but instantaneous. The deck crews, caught mid-rearm and mid-refuel, become prisoners of their own efficiency. The very systems designed to generate power, gasoline, bombs, stacked aircraft, now magnify catastrophe. These first explosions are not merely damage, they are system failure. Aviation fuel runs, ordnance cooks off, hangar decks become furnaces. Fire does what doctrine cannot. It ignores rank, it ignores schedules, it turns even the best-run carrier into a burning island. On the American carriers, disbelief hardens into comprehension. This is not a raid meant to harass or test. This is a hinge in history swinging under force. And on the Japanese bridges, command staffs attempt continuity, signals, orders, discipline, while the foundations of their operational power collapse beneath them. The shock is moral as well as tactical. Years of planning, training, and victories have produced this moment of confidence, and then, in 6 minutes, that confidence begins to burn. And as the smoke rises, a harder question follows. How could an aircraft so often dismissed as fat and slow be the instrument of such sudden destruction? Before Midway, the Douglas SBD Dauntless was respected in the way a dependable tool is respected, quietly, without romance. It was rugged, reliable, plainly built to take punishment and keep flying. No one gathered around it to admire lines of speed or the promise of the future. It was the kind of aircraft men boarded because it worked, not because it inspired. Compared to the sleek fighters that escorted it, the Dauntless seemed almost out of place. Faster aircraft carried a certain mythology, speed as protection, agility as superiority, glamour as proof of modernity. The SBD was judged by what it did not have. It was not quick enough to outrun trouble, not nimble enough to pretend trouble could be danced away. Critics called it slow, and in carrier warfare, slowness is often mistaken for helplessness, because the ocean allows no safe landing and the sky offers no cover. Yet the Dauntless had a different character, one that did not show itself in peacetime comparisons. It was stable in a dive, a platform that could be held steady when the world turned vertical. Under stress, it did not become unpredictable. It could take damage and remain controllable, absorbing violence long enough to complete the one task it was built for, placing a bomb with precision. Across both navies, a belief was hardening into doctrine. Carriers decide wars, and carriers are protected by layers. Fighters above, flak below, speed everywhere. The carrier was not merely a ship. It was a system, and the system promised safety through coordination. If the machine was well designed, the outcome would be mechanical. A second belief followed naturally, that battles are won by perfect machines, by the fastest, the newest, the most advanced. But history rarely rewards perfection. More often, it rewards fitness, the weapon that survives long enough to arrive and arrives stable enough to hit. Midway would not be a contest of elegance. It would be a test of what could endure uncertainty, hold steady under terror, and strike once, at the exact minute when everything else was exposed. And the question that lingered beneath the smoke was unsettling. If the Dauntless was so slow, why had it just rewritten the balance of an ocean? The plan for Midway was not designed as a gamble. It was designed as a demonstration, an orderly proof that Japan's new way of war could force the United States into a final, decisive submission. In Tokyo and aboard fleet flagships, Japan's leadership sought a single engagement that would end uncertainty. Midway would be the bait, an isolated American outpost that could not be ignored. The US carriers would be the prize, drawn out, located, and destroyed in open water far from land-based support. It was a strategy shaped by recent experience. Pearl Harbor, the rapid expansion across the Pacific, the repeated lesson that concentrated carrier aviation could break an enemy before he understood what was happening. But the trap depended on timing and dispersal. Forces were divided like interlocking gears: carrier strike groups, invasion transports, support battleships, submarines stretched across the approaches. Each component expected to move precisely, each report expected to arrive on time. The ocean itself was part of the mechanism. Distance would delay American reactions, and distance would hide Japanese movement until the net was ready to close. In briefing rooms, certainty had a tone. The Americans will come. They have to. And when they do, they will arrive where we want them. It was not shouted. It was spoken like mathematics. This was the quiet confidence of an organization that believes it has solved war into a system. Japanese pilots were elite, their doctrine sharp. They had trained for coordinated strikes and disciplined recovery cycles, for the hard rhythm of carrier operations at sea. Yet doctrine, however brilliant, can become a comfort blanket, something held too tightly when reality shifts. It encourages the belief that if procedures are followed, outcomes will follow. On a flight deck, a junior officer watches aircraft being armed and moved into position. The work is precise, practiced, almost elegant. In that moment, the rhythm itself feels like safety, as if an efficient deck is an armored deck. This was the arrogance, not loud, not reckless, but managerial. We have built a machine, therefore the outcome is mechanical. But what no plan can fully calculate is the moment the machine meets an unexpected hand on the lever, when distance, meant to protect, becomes the very corridor through which disaster arrives. America came to Midway carrying scars that could not be hidden by fresh paint. In June 1942, the US Navy was outnumbered in carriers, short on experienced aircrews, and still learning how to fight a war that Japan had already been practicing at full speed. What sailed west was not a confident armada. It was a gamble made with imperfect strength, because there was no other way to stop the tide. Yet the real advantage was not measured in tonnage or aircraft counts. It was measured in knowledge. In quiet rooms far from the flight deck, cryptanalysts and intelligence officers had been breaking patterns, assembling fragments, turning intercepted messages into something usable. It was not a crystal-clear picture. It was a map drawn in probabilities. But in war, probabilities are sometimes the only form of sight. Commanders acted on that incomplete vision and still had to commit men and ships into open water. Knowing an enemy plan does not remove the ocean. It does not remove fuel limits. It does not remove the possibility that the enemy is somewhere else entirely. They moved because the alternative was to wait, and waiting would mean giving Japan the freedom to choose the next blow. There was a kind of arrogance in this, too, but a different kind than Japan's. Not the arrogance of certainty, but the arrogance of confidence in intellect. Faith that analysis could compensate for weakness in steel. That a well-read signal could matter more than a larger flight deck. It was a modern belief, and like all beliefs, it carried risk. In an operations space, staff officers leaned over charts and marked the Pacific with pencil lines. A carrier here, an estimated course there, a search arc traced across blank water. They understood what those thin graphite marks truly meant. In a few hours, lines on a map would translate into burning ships and missing men. And far above the sea, the dauntless squadrons became instruments of decisions made nowhere near their cockpits, strategy expressed in altitude, headings, and the brutal mathematics of fuel. Pilots would fly the plan, but they would also live or die by it. The stage was set for a strange kind of battle. One side might know, and still lose, because knowledge is not victory unless it can be converted into a hit. Some machines enter a war as legends. The SBD Dauntless entered as a workhorse, noticed only when it failed to return, and quietly respected when it did. On paper and on the flight deck, it looked like what it was, a working tool. dive brakes that could hold it steady in a near-vertical plunge, a sturdy frame that tolerated rough carrier landings and battle damage, a reputation among crews for bringing men home when more elegant aircraft did not. It was not beautiful. It was dependable, an attribute rarely celebrated until the day it becomes the difference between survival and absence. Its limitations were real, and everyone knew them. The Dauntless was not fast, and its range demanded strict discipline. Every mission became a tight equation: distance to target, time over the search area, fuel for the return. A pilot could not simply chase opportunity, he had to measure it against the needle dropping toward empty. In the Pacific, that constraint was not technical, it was existential. And yet the aircraft was built around one purpose that mattered more than appearances: to place a bomb where it had to go, when it had to arrive. The Dauntless did not promise dominance, it promised precision, the kind that turns a difficult target into a reachable one if the pilot can hold his nerve through the dive. In training, accuracy was demanded with an almost moral seriousness. On a range, a miss was a failure of discipline. In combat, accuracy became something darker, almost a form of mercy. The more precisely a carrier could be struck, the less time the battle had to grow, the fewer aircraft would need to die trying to finish what a scattered bomb load could not. On the deck, ground crews ran hands along rivets and panels as if touching a talisman. Maintenance became its own quiet faith, tightening, checking, listening to the engine note, knowing that craftsmanship on the ground would be tested by terror in the air. Slowly, belief began to fracture. Perhaps survivability and precision mattered more than speed in the decisive instant. Perhaps the perfect machine was not the one that looked invincible, but the one that could absorb chaos and still deliver. Midway would not judge the Dauntless by reputation or ridicule. It would judge it by the only standard war truly respects: the violence it could deliver on schedule. The first enemy at Midway was not steel or gunfire. It was geography, an ocean so large that a carrier task force could vanish inside it and leave nothing behind but unanswered headings. American air groups launched into uncertainty, climbing away from their carriers with no visual confirmation that anything waited ahead. Navigation became an exercise in dead reckoning, careful compass work, and strict radio discipline. Silence was protection, but silence also meant isolation. Each aircraft was a small, fragile calculation moving across an empty map. In the cockpit, a pilot scanned the horizon for the faintest sign: smoke, glint, a line that did not belong to sea or sky. Often there was nothing, and the fuel gauge did not care about hope. It measured time with mechanical honesty. Every minute spent searching was a minute taken from the return, and every mile flown without contact turned the mission into a question of survival rather than success. Meanwhile, aircraft from Midway Island struck first. They went in under heavy opposition and paid for it, their losses exposing a hard truth. Hitting carriers protected by fighters and flak was not simply a matter of courage. It was a matter of geometry, timing, and luck. Attacks could be brave and still be ineffective, and ineffective attacks in carrier warfare did not merely fail. They bled strength that could not be replaced in a single afternoon. On the Japanese decks, the work continued. Aircraft were cycled, fueled, armed, repositioned. The strike force remained in motion, caught between competing demands and shifting reports: launch for one mission, rearm for another, prepare for threats that might be real or might be phantom. This was the paradox of a well-run system. Its efficiency depended on rhythm, and rhythm could be disrupted by uncertainty. The struggle layered itself into something more complex than find and attack. It became find, coordinate, survive, and still arrive together, because a scattered attack was often no attack at all. Innovation in this moment was not a new weapon. It was procedure: scouting patterns, launch timing, the discipline to press on when logic said turn back. Because sometimes the only way to win the Pacific was to keep flying into blankness until blankness finally revealed a target. The torpedo squadrons went in low, where courage could not hide behind altitude, and where speed was not an advantage, but an invitation to be killed. At sea level, the air is thicker, the horizon closer, the enemy larger. The aircraft used for these attacks were slow and vulnerable, forced into a straight run that demanded exposure. There was little room for improvisation. A torpedo plane could not dive away like a bomber or climb into safety like a fighter. It had to hold course, steady and visible, closing the distance while every defensive gun had time to aim. And yet they attacked, because doctrine required it, and because someone had to force the enemy to react. As the torpedo planes came in, Japanese fighters dropped from above to meet them, pulled downward by the most immediate threat. In doing so, they dragged the defensive canopy with them, leaving the high altitudes thinner, less guarded. It was a tactical exchange made in blood, and it would be paid in full. A pilot watched flak bursts punch the air ahead like black fists. He held course anyway. At this height, the ocean was not scenery, it was the grave waiting beneath him. If he missed, he would die with the torpedo still on his rack. If he released too early, it would run harmlessly wide. The waterline, where ship met sea, became the only point in the world that mattered. The attacks failed in the most visible way. Few torpedoes struck home. Squadrons were shredded. The sea took men and machines with indifferent speed, but in another sense, they succeeded, strategically, invisibly, by reshaping the geometry of the battle. Japanese CAP descended and dispersed, chasing low attackers across the surface, while their carriers below continued to cycle aircraft, decks crowded with fueled and armed machines. This was the grim logic of combined arms in its purest form. One group bleeds so another can strike, not as poetry, as mechanism. And above that slaughter, climbing in thinner air where the fighters had been drawn away, the dauntless squadrons were approaching, about to inherit an opening purchased at a catastrophic price. Dive bombing is not reckless descent. It is controlled violence, altitude, angle, speed, and timing forced to collapse into a single aim point with no room left for doubt. From high above the Pacific, the SBD Dauntless begins to reveal what it was truly built to do. In level flight, it seems ordinary, even disadvantaged. But in the dive, it becomes something else entirely, a stable platform falling with purpose. Its dive brakes, those perforated flaps that many dismissed as unnecessary weight, turn slow into steady, giving a pilot control when the aircraft should be screaming out of control. It is not designed to escape danger. It is designed to remain inside it long enough to be accurate. In the cockpit, the world narrows through the gun sight. The carrier below grows from a dark speck into a defined shape. Flight deck, island superstructure, the faint suggestion of movement. Fear does not vanish. It is simply forced into procedure. Throttle set, dive angle checked, brakes deployed, release altitude memorized. In these seconds, terror becomes a mechanical checklist because a mind that hesitates at 10,000 feet does not survive the pullout at 1,500. Below, the Japanese carriers are at their most vulnerable. Their decks are alive with activity, aircraft being positioned, fuel present in lines and tanks, ordnance exposed in the open air, and the hangar decks beneath. It is the moment of maximum offensive readiness, and therefore maximum fragility. Carrier warfare, for all its modern power, rests on a dangerous truth. The ship that launches aircraft must temporarily become a floating bomb itself. The dauntless squadrons arrive not as a swarm but as judgment, vertical, sudden, and hard to stop. High-altitude attackers compress time. There is no long approach to track, no slow build-up of warning. There is only the realization, too late, that the sky has become a weapon. And the plane's supposed weakness becomes its strength. It can hold the dive. It can place the bomb. It can deliver irreversible damage in the few seconds the target is exposed. The struggle reaches its threshold here, in the space between altitude and impact. Either the attack lands now, or the balance of the war tilts the other way and does not tilt back.